In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. This podcast is not just about dissecting topics from two different perspectives. It's also about how to have conversations on difficult topics while avoiding the urge to tear someone's head off and vomit down the bloody stump of their neck. All right, so we are talking about subsidies, and we're going to focus specifically on subsidies, the oil industry and farming, agriculture industry. And next week, we're going to talk about a different aspect of subsidies, so we'll just focus on that one today. So do you have a preference on which way we go with this?
No, I don't.
Okay. So when we had our conversation didn't go so well, I read you the definition of the subsidy, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was basically, it could be any type of government assistance to individuals or to groups. And the reason why that's important is because when we look at, if we start off with the oil industry, there's all different types of support that they get. And depending on whether you're getting your information from somebody that is pro-oil and feels like that what they get is really not that big of a deal, or someone that's anti-oil and feels like that they are really making a contract with the devil and selling us their black tea. There's different opinions on it, and the reason, a couple of them that I ran across, one was they talk about the tax expenditures that the federal government allows the oil well development process. They can deduct 100% of their expenses. There's direct spending subsidies, such as that when oil is shipped across or shipped down, they're using the waterways, that they can get a pretty strong discount for using the oil or for shipping it through the waterways that other companies do not. There's some royalty relief, I'm sorry. And then the other one that they mentioned was companies are given leniency when they fulfill their regulatory obligations. For example, an example that's given is that when the BP oil spill, that was massive, and they were fined and they paid out $334 million, and the company was allowed to deduct that tax or that bill on their taxes. So if we start off talking about the oil industry and their subsidies, what are your thoughts?
Oh, I think it's a waste of money, and it was interesting how you phrased it, though. You said it was almost as if it became this dichotomy of either you are for oil and you think this is great, or you're against oil and you think this is terrible. But I would go a different path. Like, I'm fine with oil. I think eventually we need to move to more sustainable fuel sources, and I'm fine with, I think solar's great. I really think we missed the boat on nuclear energy, as we've talked about in the past. But whether or not I have a problem with oil, I just don't think that the government should be subsidizing these enterprises. Mm-hmm. And leave aside the fact that they are doing very well anyway, because I'm sure there are times when they're not, or there have been companies that are not doing well. But the government should just stay out of it and let the market figure out what would be the best and most efficient methodology for, powering cars, powering, heating homes, whatever. All these different types of things the market should decide. The only way maybe they should step in is if they had some sort of tax on a negative externality like pollution or something like that. I'd be fine if they did something like that. But yeah, it's a pretty good example of how, I don't know if the right word is schizophrenic the government could be, because on the one hand they're subsidizing oil, on the other hand they're subsidizing ethanol, on the other hand they're subsidizing solar, on the other hand, they're making all these different, they're spending all this money, so we're investing in things that we otherwise wouldn't be, because it becomes less expensive to invest in these enterprises. And then, yeah, they subsidize them, but at the same time, they restrict new oil leases. They have these weird restrictions, but then these subsidies and these incentives in other areas. I think it's one of the big problems with government that probably when a lot of these things were put in place, it was nothing malicious. It was, some politician from somewhere said, well, they're not using our waterways. Let's get an incentive so I can bring some money to my district, to my area. Or somebody was saying, hey, this is great. This is going to create jobs. They made great arguments as to why this stuff should be done. But in the long run, government should just not be involved. I hope that is clear, but
Yeah.
kind of
And this is one that you and I are going to agree on. I do agree that it is not an industry that needs a lot of government assistance. It's a well seasoned, well established industry. I do feel that there are certain industries that when they're coming off the ground, maybe there's some benefit to society that they could get some help with, but this is not one of those. Maybe there was at some point. My gut agrees with you also that probably the way that these subsidies came about was certain politicians, and that of course politicians usually look fairly locally. How can my constituency benefit? And they put something in place, whether it's assistance for the shipping, or maybe someone where there's a lot of oil refining going on, or a lot of oil exploration, looking to assist and bring some jobs to the area. I probably would. I think that makes a lot of sense as to how that might have happened. One of the things I've heard mentioned when people are pushing back against removing oil subsidies, or trying to keep the oil price low, trying not to overtax it, trying to add more taxes to it, is that people will frame the argument about it being beneficial to the poor. We need to keep the price of gas low because the poor benefit, which is a really interesting argument, and a foolish argument, because it's not just the poor that drive. Everybody drives. So it's not just the poor that benefit. And it's something that people try and distort the reality a little bit when they want to frame it in a way that's beneficial to them. So yeah, I agree. I don't see much benefit in a lot of support to the oil industry. The pollution aside, I don't know that anyone is arguing that there's an infinite amount of oil. And so we will eventually run out of oil. And so we should be spending energy, effort, and resources in trying to find alternatives to oil. We are a very oil dependent society, and we should be working towards diversifying and finding alternatives.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree that we should be finding alternatives, but I don't think it's the government's job to try to figure out how to find those alternatives. I would say if they're creating incentives and they're giving subsidies to oil companies, that is not encouraging us to find other alternatives.
Right.
But on the other hand, I don't want them to be stepping in and giving all sorts of incentives for other industries. They should not be the ones deciding where those incentives go, where those subsidies go. They should just wait for the market to figure it out, and the market would eventually figure it out. We always get this idea that, well, without the government stepping in and helping, we'd never have any alternatives. And then we look closer at it and we realize that they're doing more to keep the status quo than we'd even realized. You know what I mean? Like they've been restricting nuclear power for 70 years. They've been subsidizing the oil and gas industry for years. And so, yeah, while they have helped the solar industry, maybe that was a good move. It seems like it was. There's probably a number of other alternatives that we never came up with because the government chose the solar industry to be the winner, or tried to incentivize it to be a winner. Maybe that was good. I don't know, but I don't like the government deciding which industries it wants to try to help along and which ones it shouldn't. I just don't. I really push back against that.
I have no doubt you would. And that is a very interesting topic, and I'm looking forward to debating it with you next week, because I think that there can be some benefits to government supporting some research and all that. But let's push that back till next week. If you're comfortable with the where we are with the oil, since we covered it fairly quickly, you good moving towards the farm, where I think we're going to disagree a little bit?
Oh, okay, yeah, we're going to disagree on that. Okay.
Makes it a little more interesting.
Yeah.
And to start off the conversation on the farm subsidies, I want to read to you a quote. Have you ever read The Omnivore's Dilemma, Michael Pollan? It's a very interesting book, and I would recommend it. And Chris and I listened to it as an audio book when we were driving. It was something that you could really get into, and it really doesn't deal specifically with subsidies. It's more farming, agriculture, and food production in general. But there was a section where it says, when it comes to food, nature can make a mockery of the classic economics of supply and demand. Nature in the form of good or bad weather, of course, but also the nature of the human body, which can consume only so much food, no matter how plentiful the supply. He writes that establishing a reserve of grains is a very ancient practice recommended in the Bible, and the reserve would make sure food was available during harsher harvests while protecting farmers from putting too much food into the market. So if we start this conversation with it, hold on, it is Daniel that interpreted the Pharaoh's dream of the.
Joseph.
Who was it?
Joseph.
Joseph. You're right. Yeah. Yes, of course you're right. Right. So the Pharaoh had the dream. Seven. What was it? Seven healthy. You tell it.
Yeah, the Pharaoh had a dream. There was, if I'm remembering correctly, there were two dreams. One was seven fat kine, which I guess in ancient England, or in England a few years ago, Victorian England, meant cows. So there were seven fat cows, and they were kind of eating there. And then along came seven skinny cows, and they ate the fat cows. And I think there was 7 bushels of grain, and then they were consumed by the skinny ones or something like that. But the long and short of it was they expected 7 years of bounty and a lot of food, and then there was going to be 7 years of famine. So Joseph told the Pharaoh that we should be storing everything that we could for 7 years, and everybody will come to us and ask for the food when the time comes. And then the famine came after 7 years, and they had their storehouses full.
And so that's the basis for one of the arguments for the subsidies of farms, which is that farming can be very erratic, that you can't really predict the weather. You have good harvests, you have bad harvests. And from what I understand, the farming can, as an industry, can be sort of fragile. And that if you have a couple of years of bad harvests, or if the farmers aren't able to produce enough income, that a lot of farmers can go out of business. And so the government is in the business of helping to provide a little bit of support. And one way they do that is by buying surplus and storing it so that it can be then put out there or put to market when there's times of scarcity. And there's a couple different ways that they do that. One is they actually buy it and they store it at a predetermined price. Another way is that they give the farmers the ability to store it, and they somehow like postpone debt that these farmers might have. And then when prices are better, meaning there's a little more scarcity in the market, the farmers can then sell it off so that the farmers are not, I guess, at the whim of nature, but have a little more control over what the price at which they get their product. And if you compare that to manufacturing, the manufacturers can do that because they have total control. When there's a glut in the market, they'll pull back. When there's when there's a scarcity in the market, they'll produce more. And so it's that same idea of giving that market control to the farmers. Thoughts?
Yeah, I disagree, unsurprisingly. You act as if the farmers don't have the control that I think they have. There are going to be times, I think, there are going to be times when, there are adverse events, both in nature, in the market in general, just like there is for any business. I mean, you could make the argument in any business that prices go up, to some restaurant owner, the food prices go up, or demand changes. There's an upturn, a downturn in the economy. All these things affect business owners, and they need to be smart. And if we think that farmers are somehow different, that they aren't going to realize, just like everybody else, that you should put some money away for a rainy day, I don't know why we think they're different. They know that. And good farmers that survive the long term are careful. There are going to be instances where, maybe any farmer would have failed in some area, but I think the government stepping in and making these decisions, I think they create more problems than they solve. One small example is we were looking at all the problems, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about all the problems that California has with water.
Mm-hmm.
And at different times, they've been telling the homeowners that they can't water their lawns, and they have to xeriscape and do all these different things. Well, when you look at what's going on in California, 80% of the water is used by farmers, and it accounts for 2% of the economy. And so a massive amount of water is going into this small part of the economy because it's very inexpensive for people to get water there. And so they need to make some changes. I read one news story where this reporter went out there and was asking, they were growing rice in California, and they would flood they would flood irrigate their rice. He said, well, that's not a very efficient way. Aren't you losing a lot of water to evaporation? And the guy he's talking to says, yeah, they lose a ton of water that way. Well, why don't they do something different? Because the equipment costs so much to do it more efficiently, and the water's so cheap. And so the government is allowing this water to be used so cheaply by farmers, and then we're wasting a lot of water. So that's essentially a subsidy. It's not money given to them, but it's essentially a subsidy because they're not charging the market rates. They're saying to homeowners, hey, you can't use as much, but the farmers are using a ton because they want to be the breadbasket of the country or something like that. It's a big part of their economy. But if they raised the price of water and stopped using as much as they use, then farming would go to different areas. Now, overall, maybe that would be more expensive, but then people could use water in California, and you wouldn't have these droughts that we're having in different areas. So the government, when it steps in and tries to help out or do different things for different areas, it tends to skew the market a little bit and make poor choices. Like, we pay a lot more for sugar than we could otherwise pay because we're subsidizing sugar farmers and putting tariffs on sugar that comes in from other countries. I mean, you said before when you were talking about oil that it disproportionately affects poor people. I didn't want to take issue with it, but I think this is a similar thing. Like, when the government subsidizes a particular group of farmers, and those farmers then are able to produce, they can sell it at higher prices or they can produce this sugar or whatever they're getting, even though it could be produced cheaper someplace else. Well, that's going to affect poor people because the price of sugar is going to be more expensive because the government is subsidizing it, because the government is charging more for water. And if you talk about oil and gas or food or anything else, yeah, I really do think that it affects poor people more. If the price of gas went from, I was going to say $2 a gallon, but now it's like $4.50 or $5. If the price of gas goes from $5 a gallon to 20, well, rich people are going to be able to get around just fine. Who's going to be affected more is poor people that are trying to get to the store or go to their jobs. Yeah, it affects them more than it affects other people.
For
and
sure.
The same when the government distorts the market with subsidies for farming, it does the same thing.
Well, okay, so I think there's two sides to the subsidy conversation. There's the supply side and the demand side, and at this point, we're looking at it primarily from the supply side so far. I mean, you did not entirely. You did mention about how it affects the price as well. So you did talk a little bit about the demand side, but if you didn't have what the government is trying to do, whether they do this or not is a different story. With this particular issue, they're trying to stabilize the market, so you don't have the big whipsaws up and downs. If there's an abundant year, if all the harvests all across the country do really, really well, all of a sudden there's a big glut on the market and the prices drop dramatically. And the next year there's a couple big storms and there's a late spring and then it's a very dry summer and then some hurricanes come through, and that year there's a very poor harvest, and so that year the prices go way up. And so what the government is attempting to do is to bring in a little stability to that market, both for the producer and for the purchaser, so that the producer is able to stay in business and the purchaser knows from one year to the next, maybe inflation will have an impact on it, but there's a continuity to the price of some of the product that's going out there. Now, you will argue, I'm sure, that it's an inefficient system, and I would agree with you that there's definitely some inefficiencies in there, and that there are certain producers that are that benefit more than others. In fact, I ran across one to kind of support your side of things. There's 5 major crops that the government subsidizes: corn, soy, wheat, cotton, and rice. And actually, given your story you just told, maybe that's one of the ways in which rice is subsidized from the government. And so there's most of the subsidies. Where's the other one? The richest farmers are the ones that benefit from most of the subsidies. I think the richest 10% of the farm operations receive nearly two-thirds of the subsidies. And the other fact that I saw is that most of the subsidies go to the feed for animals, which was sort of interesting. Because we have this expectation that meat will be affordable, whether you're talking fish, chicken, pork, beef, whatever it might be. And of course, we live in a world where we don't need to be eating nearly as much meat as most people expect and demand to be eating. So that's one way in which I would agree with you that the subsidization of the subsidizing of the agribusinesses is not as efficient as it could be. But I think if you go back to the original concept, which is creating that stability, both on the supply side and the demand side, I think there is some value to it.
Well, I guess I'd say a couple of things about that. One, price already does the thing that you're talking about. So, for example, if we have a drought or storms or a bad crop one year, well, then the price of that crop is going to go up because the supply has gone down.
Sure.
And so when the price goes up, then all of a sudden across the world, there's this big incentive to bring that crop to America. And especially when we have this worldwide economy now, shipping, airplanes, everything else. Of course, if we got rid of the Jones Act for shipping, so shipping around our country could be done a lot more cheaply, that would allow for, do you remember we talked about the Jones Act a little while ago?
Refresh my memory.
It's this act that was passed, and I think it was like 70 or 80 years ago, where shipping around the country has to be done only by American ships with American flags. And so that increases the cost of shipping anything around the country. Anyway, but it's much easier to get crops from other countries, from other parts of the country. I mean, for there to be a famine, like when you had a famine in Egypt, that was feasible. But to have a famine both in California and in North Dakota and in Iowa, I mean, all across the country is somewhat unlikely. To have it also in Canada, to have it also in other parts of the world, in all of Africa, it just seems unlikely. So when the price goes up, then immediately we start to get products from other parts of the world that are other parts of the country and other parts of the world that fill that demand. Now, these farmers are smart people too, which is how they've gotten these subsidies. But they're smart people that, they're going to plan for the future as well. They're not going to sell everything out because they know that prices might go up. There's going to be people that are going to bet on that, or going to say, well, I'm going to store some of this because there is going to be a drought at some point, or there's not storms or whatever. So I think all of this could be done without the government stepping in, and the government is not set up to appropriately do this for a number of reasons. One, centrally planned economies just don't work, so they're not going to be very good at planning all this stuff out. Two, there's too much incentive for special interests to step in. And once again, I don't think it's very malicious most of the time, but if some politician is told by somebody, hey, these farmers in this area, they need your help. And by the way, if you give them the help, they're going to vote for you, but they need your help. And it's for the good of these people. They need your help. And so then the politician says, okay, I'm going to give them the help. This is how, he's not saying to himself explicitly, maybe this is how I get elected, but ultimately he knows that he's going to hear those arguments from people, and he's going to be somewhat swayed because he knows he gets a whole block of farmers that are going to be voting for him. A lot of his constituents, if he votes in favor of these subsidies for them or whatever programs are going to help these farmers. So I just don't think there's anybody that's going to be unbiased in doing their best. It would be impossible to do a great job because it's such a complex system. with so many moving parts and so much of the world involved now. We're not just talking about Iowa or one part of Iowa. We're talking about the whole country and the whole world. We can get goods from anywhere. And then, yeah, the incentives that they have to cater to the special interests just make it impossible for them to think about this reasonably, to get reasonable information. It's going to be very, very biased information, not maliciously so, but it's going to be somewhat biased because the farmer is going to have every reason to believe that his business needs this. Am I making sense with that?
You are, and I hear you, and I think there is some validity to your points. But I think one of the challenges is that when you have in manufacturing, if there's a shortage of some particular material, then manufacturers can start to ramp up production. And then if they produce too much,
the raw material, Brian.
What's that?
What if it's a raw material?
Well, it depends on the material, because if you're talking something that's mined or something that's foraged, something that's found, well, you can put on more shifts, you can try and hire more people, you can do something to try and increase production of that collection of that material. Farming, okay, so if I recall correctly, it takes 2 years to go from the getting the permit to build a house to putting the house on the market. 2 years. And what that means is, if you're recognizing there's a rise in prices and you want to try and take advantage of that, you want to build some more houses, it's going to take you 2 years to get your increase in production to the market. Now, farming is not quite 2 years. Farming does have an annual cycle, though. If you look at some of the typical crops, you plant them in the spring, you harvest them in the fall. And there are some climates in which you can harvest year round, but as far in my knowledge of farming is a bit limited, I'll acknowledge. I don't know that you have crops that can be planted and harvested year round. Maybe that is the case, but even if it is, there's not a lot of climates or a lot of crops in which that can happen. And so if you as a farmer want to take advantage of a shortage, well, it's going to take you a full year to be able to take advantage of that shortage by planting and then harvesting more crops. So if there's a shortage this year, you can't produce more until next year. So you don't have the ability to react quickly to whatever the market forces are. And that's where the government steps in. Now, I totally agree that the government is inefficient. I agree that the government is prone to, I don't want to say fraud, to biases, let's say, where they're trying to help someone, whether it's well-intentioned or not. And so it's something that we're able to monitor as long as that government is transparent. But the government also has the ability to stabilize an economy. Yes, you can go to other countries to bring in crops where there's a shortage here, but those crops are already, I don't want to say accounted for. People, maybe there are some that say, I'm going to produce lots of crops, and maybe there'll be a shortage someplace, so I can sell my crops on the national commodities markets and sell them wherever I can. But it's not an efficient system in that regard.
Yeah, I don't think I would think about it that way. So if we think, for example, let's say we're talking about wheat. I mean, you're making a pretty broad assumption when you say, well, America needs more wheat. So nobody can sell more wheat to America until they plant the crops, because they would never sell anything that they have right now to America. There's no surpluses there. So they can't sell anything until they plant the crops, wait a year for it to grow or something like that. It's just not the way that it works. There's surpluses in one area and shortages in another. But then they take those surpluses and they send it someplace else. Or they say, well, I was going to sell this wheat here in India or here in Africa, but instead I'll sell 30% of it or 80% of it to America because prices are high there, and then we'll make do with something else. I mean, this stuff moves around a lot. It's almost as if, I think you should think about it, Brian, that there's demand in different areas and supply in different areas, and if you were to try to predict it in just one area, that's really difficult. But the broader the area that you're looking at, the lower the standard deviations. It's almost like when Walmart has Walmart, when they predict demand at a certain super center, they don't predict it just at one super center. They predict it at a distribution center because they say, well, if I get the battery, and I know I'm kind of reaching here, so try to stick with me as I make this analogy.
Okay.
But, for example, let's say you're saying, okay, I think we're going to sell 2,000 batteries at this one Walmart super center, or store. And you're wrong. You're off by 500. Well, if you're just predicting just that one store, your standard deviations are going to vary widely. But if you're doing that for a whole distribution area, maybe 20 or 30 or 50 super centers, stores, then if you're wrong 500, negative in one area and 300 high in another area, and these all kind of balance out, and it's much easier to predict the demand in that way. So when you're looking at the world as a whole, yeah, there's going to be short. It's not like there's a worldwide famine or worldwide storms. The whole world is this huge interconnected network of people, and different parts of the country can supply more wheat. Maybe there's been a bumper crop in Iowa, but not in California. So they offset each other. And when prices go up in California and there's too much supply in Iowa, then they kind of balance each other out. The same goes for other countries. So yeah, I think you're simplifying a bit when you say, well, only the government can step in and protect these farmers. This whole interconnected network of people producing food across the whole country, across the whole world, they're going to do a much better job of meeting the demand according to price than the government ever will. That's the whole idea behind the free market, and why centrally planned economies just don't work as well. I mean, to your point, they're not going to be perfect, and I think you just have more faith in what they're able to do than I do. I think the free market is going to do a much better job of meeting that demand, because price is going to fluctuate in different areas, and immediately people are going to go to fill that demand, and they don't have to wait until next year. They might have excess supply wherever they are, or maybe in Iowa they're like, well, we were going to sell a lot of wheat here to Iowa. Instead, maybe we'll sell alfalfa, or instead of people using corn for ethanol, maybe they now use it to sell it as food if the price of corn goes up. Am I making sense with those arguments?
Yeah, you are. And we're getting into an area where my knowledge is a little bit thin, but I believe that global balancing or exchange, I believe it already exists in the commodity markets. I could be wrong, but I think that you already have a shifting back and forth, and that if you can get a better price for soybeans out in let's say Europe, well, you'll sell the soybeans in Europe and then you'll ship them over there, but then of course you've got higher shipping costs. You got to take that into consideration. And so I believe we already have this global market that tries to balance it out, but it's still not as efficient as it could be. Clearly they haven't solved all the problems, because we hear about Sri Lanka, where they had a real problem. Now, of course, one of the primary explanations for that I've heard is that they switched from some of their more effective fertilizers to things that are considered more organic, and it put a big dent in the amount of food they were able to produce. But the point being that that shortage in food was felt locally, and it wasn't necessarily solved globally. So I don't know. Go ahead. What do you want? You want to say something?
I do. Why did they change that? Who determined that they needed to change those fertilizers?
It was either the president or the prime minister.
So the government created those problems.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and they were, I think, it seemed like they were well-intentioned. At least it seemed that way, that they were trying to be more environmentally friendly or something like that. But yeah, the government stepped in and said, hey, we need to use these better fertilizers. Now they have all these problems. It was the government stepping in and tipping the scales and taking the power away from the free market to make their own decisions. Now, I'm not saying that should never happen, but we should be very careful. When government steps in, it becomes difficult. Like, we say, well, the world didn't solve this country's problems. Yeah, because the government created a massive problem that isn't easy to solve right away.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's so much out there to help people. Like, there's so much foreign aid. Like, we're helping people when they have these. Well, even foreign aid, we should spend one of our conversations talking about the foreign aid creates.
I'll put that one down. Sure.
Yeah, that would be an interesting one to me because I think there's a lot of problems that are created with foreign aid too. But yeah, I think that a lot of that problem that we're seeing in Sri Lanka is like it's easy to say, well, the world didn't solve the problems. Well, what created it? It was government that created the problems.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would agree, but well, the problems were starting to fester and grow, and the government added. They started to magnify some of those problems. You know, they made the problems bigger than they were because you had a lot of the COVID stuff that happened. You had loans they couldn't afford to pay back to China and some other places. You had a government, and I don't know a lot of the specifics, but I would totally agree that the government had played a hand in that, and I think it's very easy to, and I know you're not doing this, but it's very easy to say anytime the government gets involved, things get worse. And there are examples, of course, where the government has created things like cleaner air than what we had before. I mean, we mentioned briefly when the Love Canal. All the pollution was so bad, rivers were catching on fire out in Ohio and in New York, and the government got involved there to say we can't be polluting quite so much because it's hard for the market forces to improve on pollution control. So there are times the government gets involved, it's bad. There are times the government gets involved and it's good. There are times the government gets involved and there are unintended consequences. And pretty much that probably covers the range of the way the government can get involved.
Yeah, I mean, to continue with what you said, I agree. I think when government should get involved is when I'll go back to that term, the negative externality. I mean, if you're a business and you're dumping, waste or sewage or byproducts into a river that's killing the wildlife and killing the fish, and that river doesn't belong to you, it's a public resource or there's other people downriver, that's when the government should step in. Is you can't dump stuff in my backyard, you can't pollute my house, you have to keep your contracts. That's where they should step in. They shouldn't be so worried about, well, I don't want you to make bad choices, so I'm going to subsidize you so you don't make bad choices, farmers, because I think you're not smart enough to prepare for the future. That's not what the government should be doing. The government should be stopping people from polluting, from dumping garbage in each other's backyards, from affecting each other's well-being, those types of things. Okay. And that's as simple as it should be for me.
And I want to end the conversation with the libertarian saying the government should be doing something. We'll stop right there. That's a good place to end.
Okay, that's fair.
So for next week, we're going to talk a little bit about the government's involvement in solar and electric cars and Tesla and all that. I want to broaden the conversation slightly, if you're willing to, and to talk about the government's involvement or support or promotion of young industries like solar, like electric cars, because I feel like those solar electric cars are a good example of the government trying to build an industry that doesn't quite exist yet, and that was why they were providing those supports. Is that okay with you?
Sure.
Okay, so next week we'll look at government supporting industry, specifically how it applied to solar and to electric cars.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, I felt like that was productive.
Okay. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah. Good conversation, Colin. I'll talk to you in a week.
Thanks, Brian.
Bye. We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.